The return of Boeing Starliner spacecraft to Earth without a crew might be the most meaningless victory in the history of space exploration. Although the Starliner smoothly detached from the space station and landed gently in New Mexico on Friday night, a happy ending to the 3-month test flight, it's kind of disappointing as the two-person crew is still stuck in orbit until next year. So, how does the conclusion of this flight impact Boeing and NASA? Is Boeing's frustration causing NASA to worry about its long-term partner leaving? Especially while the agency is also tackling tough issues with the Orion and SLS. All is going to get revealed in today's episode of Alpha Tech. And thanks for watching. While we're at it, we want to let you know we really appreciate you supporting the channel throughout this time. We're very close to 100,000 subscribers. So if you're watching and you haven't yet already, please hit that subscribe button now. Thank you so much. All right, back into it. So September 6th, Starliner had a relatively peaceful journey back to Earth. The Starliner spacecraft started its return journey by departing from its docking port at the space station at 6:04 p.m. Eastern, a day after the astronauts closed the hatch in preparation for the spacecraft's departure. The capsule fired its thrusters to quickly pull away from the complex, preparing for an orbit burn to guide Starliner on a trajectory towards its landing site. Later, Starliner jettisoned its disposable surface module to burn up over the Pacific Ocean, while the crew module, with an empty cockpit, headed for New Mexico. After gliding through the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean and Mexico, Starliner deployed 3 main parachutes to slow its descent, followed by 6 airbags inflating around the spacecraft's bottom to cushion the landing impact. This marked the 3rd time a Starliner capsule's flown in space and the 2nd one that the spacecraft failed to achieve all of its objectives. So the question we're asking is whether there are still issues with this Starliner spacecraft. Despite its success, the return was not flawless. NASA stated that one of the thrusters on the spacecraft's crew module malfunctioned during testing after the spacecraft detached from the space station. However, thanks to the system's redundancy, the faulty thruster did not pose any problems. Besides this anomaly, 2 of the service module thrusters got hotter than normal. NASA had intentionally inhibited the fail-off or deselect software that gathered more data, so none failed like before. So there are indeed some lingering issues with Starliner. Now NASA and Boeing will begin evaluating what happened with the spacecraft and able to determine if Boeing needs to change the design of the propulsion system, control it differently to avoid overloading the thrusters, or conduct another test flight. Notably, NASA mentioned it could still certify Starliner for a regular crew rotation mission, despite not bringing Wilmore and Williams back. While NASA officials seemed pretty positive, even celebrating Starliner's safe return, Boeing appeared rather indifferent to the outcome. 3 NASA managers, including Stitch, answered reporters' questions during a presser on Saturday morning after the Starliner landed. The 2 Boeing officials that were supposed to join the briefing canceled at the last minute. Boeing did not explain their absence, and the company has not provided any official to answer questions since NASA decided to end Starliner's test flight without the crew on board. It seems Boeing is really struggling to accept this decision by NASA. Boeing's been more than eager to have astronauts aboard the Starliner, and they're very confident in Starliner's ability to safely return astronauts to Earth. This latest mission was supposed to be the final test before NASA could certify Starliner for regular flights. However, everything feels kind of plastic and hollow at this point. Meanwhile, Kelly Ortberg, Boeing's new CEO, is deciding whether to maintain the company's space business. If it were up to Richard Abufalia, an aviation industry analyst at Aerodynamic Advisory, Mr. Ortberg would get rid of it as soon as possible. I would argue for selling their space business if they can, he said. Space travel is not a core Boeing business, and it's been plagued by problems far beyond Starliner. One of the factors blamed is the communications breakdown between company heads and the people that are actually doing the work. The top execs don't understand what's going on, and they're not interested in finding out. The idea of taking over an engineering company and letting non-engineers run it with a complete lack of understanding of the major technical challenges is what's causing the trouble. Boeing would take another reputational hit if it pulled out of the space business. But I don't see a reason to continue if they can't find a buyer. Right now, they're $45 billion in debt. They badly need to invest in their core business. Beyond space, Boeing right now is facing multiple very widely public crises. From the ongoing issues of their 737s linked to 2 fatal crashes that killed a total of 346 people, to a door latch popping off mid-flight and losing $1 billion to refit Air Force One, there have been many scandals that the public right now is at risk of becoming numb to them. After all this, it's still unclear whether Boeing, with its current indifference, will withdraw from the Starliner project. On one hand, NASA officials here are confident that Boeing will continue the Commercial Crew Program. However, it's strange that Boeing officials haven't said the same. A public statement from Boeing on the evening of September 7th was not exactly a clear commitment. "I want to recognize the work of the Starliner teams and what they did to ensure safe undocking, deorbit reentry and landing," said Mark Nappy, VP and Program Manager of Boeing's Commercial Crew Program. "We'll review the data and determine the next steps for the program." To be honest, Boeing and NASA have collaborated for decades, and only recently has their relationship soured. Clearly, NASA is not the one breaking up with Boeing, as Starliner is still seen as an important backup to SpaceX. NASA's eager to avoid a repeat of what happened during the 2011 to 2020 period when their space shuttle program got halted, meaning the U.S. had to rely on Russian spacecraft to get to the ISS. This means, at the very least, NASA is still very much interested in Boeing continuing the projects they're involved in. NASA doesn't want to handle all the missions alone, as the agency is already dealing with major delays and cost overruns. The most prominent topic right now is the Orion. While addressing the issues with Starliner is pretty noteworthy, what NASA is presenting with the spacecraft designed to carry humans around the moon is even more urgent. With far greater consequences, Orion will carry 4 astronauts and hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people are going to be watching humanity's first deep space mission in over 50 years. The issue concerns the safety of the heat shield located at the bottom of the capsule, which protects Orion's crew during return to Earth. Even during the Artemis 1 mission, which took Orion around the moon at the end of 2022 without astronauts, charred blocks of material cracked and peeled off Orion's heat shield during re-entry. After the spacecraft landed, engineers found over 100 areas where the re-entry pressures had damaged the heat shield. After evaluating the problem for more than a year, NASA convened an independent review team to conduct an analysis of NASA's work. First, the review is expected to be done by June, but discussions continued throughout this summer and have only recently wrapped up. The findings of the team have not yet been released, but essentially NASA faces 2 options with the heat shield. It can launch Artemis 2 with the same heat shield that Orion used on Artemis 1, or it can redesign and build a new heat shield, which could delay Artemis 2 by several years from its scheduled launch in September of next year. So far, NASA has not yet made a final call, but the situation is reminiscent of the indecision surrounding Starliner. The agency's responses have been very vague, saying things like, "A decision's still being made and everything is on track," but they are confident that the target launch date of September next year will be unaffected. Each of these choices is difficult. If NASA flies with a current heat shield, there could be opposition. As seen with the Starliner deliberations, NASA's safety community has been encouraged to voice concerns. Similarly, some of the NASA safety community might express concerns about flying the current heat shield after unexpected damage on Artemis 1. At the same time, redesigning and rebuilding a heat shield would add years to the Artemis timeline, as well as flying Artemis 2 without a crew. Both decisions will be politically and financially challenging for NASA, especially at a time when Congress is more likely to cut their budget rather than up it. Whatever NASA decides, don't expect a decision soon. No one wants to touch this political quagmire before the presidential election, and it could drag on into next year. On top of this, we can't ignore the SLS rocket that carries Orion and its massive launch tower. All are still in delays due to technical issues and rising costs, as we've broken down for you in other videos. Overall, NASA's problems keep piling up, and the agency certainly doesn't want Boeing walking away from any of their projects. Remember, Boeing's going to bear the financial burden of Starliner delays and losses. And if Boeing pulls out of Starliner now, NASA is going to have to take on the full consequences. No one can deny that the journey of the Starliner so far has been a disaster for the crew. But even as the spacecraft is nearing the end of its mission, it encounters a problem that could be said to impact the whole ISS. It feels like a scene from a sci-fi horror film. An unexplained sound emanates from a beleaguered spacecraft. It resembles a throaty sonar noise, and no one knows what's causing it. That's what happened over the weekend on the Boeing Starliner, a spacecraft currently docked to the International Space Station. After some sleuthing, NASA solved the mystery of the strange sound's origin. Of course, it wasn't aliens, but the cause wasn't as simple as the government agency initially stated. On Saturday, NASA astronaut Butch Wilmore noticed some strange noises coming from a speaker inside the Starliner spacecraft. Wilmore called down to Mission Control to ask about the unusual sounds coming from the Starliner speaker while the spacecraft was currently docked with the ISS. "There's a strange noise coming through the speaker," Wilmore tells Mission Control. "I don't know what's making it." He asks them to scratch your heads and see if you can figure out what's going on, asking them to call us if you figure it out. Mission Control noted that it sounded like a pulsing noise, almost like a sonar ping. Neither Mr. Wilmore nor the NASA staff in Mission Control appeared especially anxious about it, but Chris Hadfield, a Canadian astronaut who spent time on the space station, suggested that it would be worth worrying. There are several noises I'd prefer not to hear inside my spaceship, including this one that Boeing Starliner is now making, he wrote on X. This anomaly urged the government agency to quickly find an answer for this spacecraft, which has already encountered numerous issues. Fortunately, after investigating, NASA announced the noise seems to have just had a mundane explanation. The feedback from the speaker was the result of an audio configuration between the space station and Starliner, NASA said in a statement September 3rd. The space station audio system is complex, allowing multiple spacecraft and modules to be interconnected, and it's common to experience noise and feedback. The space agency emphasized that the feedback has no technical impact on the spacecraft crew, station operations, or plans to bring Starliner back home from orbit. In fact, astronauts occasionally notice such strange occurrences in space. For example, during China's first manned space flight in 2003, astronaut Yang Liwei reported hearing something that sounded like an iron bucket being hit with a wooden hammer while in orbit. Later, scientists realized that the noise was caused by small deformations in the spacecraft due to pressure differences between the inner and outer walls. Well, although this phenomenon may not pose a danger to a well-maintained spacecraft, for Starliner, the issue is much more complex. In reality, Starliner repeatedly has encountered technical malfunctions, making this project a very troubling story in the space industry. It's part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program that involves the space agency pairing up with private companies to ferry astronauts to and from the ISS. SpaceX's Dragon capsule has been flying astronauts for years. Boeing's trying to catch up, but Starliner has encountered multiple technical glitches during its test flights. Starliner's first crewed test flight took Wilmore and Williams to the ISS in June, but leaks and thruster malfunctions mean the astronauts will be coming back on a SpaceX Dragon capsule and not a Starliner. Wilmore and Williams originally planned for an 8-day stay on the ISS, but now scheduled to come back early next year. If Starliner not only fails to safely return the crew, but also endangers the whole ISS, it would be another major blow to the reputations of both Boeing and NASA. Notably, NASA seems to have shown a particular favoritism towards Boeing's Starliner project. Even after making the final decision, NASA's administrator confidently declared that Starliner would be 100% ready to resume its mission soon. This raises questions about NASA's transparency in disclosing issues related to the unusual sounds on Starliner. Could this be an attempt to justify and avoid harsher criticism of the project? Earlier in June, when Starliner had just docked with the ISS for a few days, there were reports of an emergency sound on the space station. However, NASA later explained that it was simply a misunderstanding during the crew's drill and everything was safe. Regardless, these incidents and vague explanations have eroded the trust of space enthusiasts in NASA. It's inevitable that various theories about Starliner's situation will arise, as confidence in the collaboration between NASA and Starliner is being seriously shaken. However, it is important to emphasize that these doubts do not imply NASA's deliberately hiding info about Starliner's return schedule. Despite the numerous issues, the spacecraft still must complete its mission and return to Earth. In anticipation of the uncrewed return of Boeing Starliner spacecraft from the ISS, NASA held a pre-departure briefing on Wednesday, September 4th, from its Johnson Space Center in Houston. NASA's Steve Stitch outlined the step-by-step process for Starliner's return to Earth. The sequence of events will approximately begin 45 minutes before the spacecraft undocks from ISS, when a go or no-go poll will be conducted, factoring in conditions at the designated landing site in White Sands, New Mexico. Once cleared, undocking is expected to happen at 6:04 p.m. Eastern Time, with springs instantly pushing the spacecraft away from the ISS. A short thruster burn will follow 30 seconds later, designed to further separate Starliner from the ISS. At approximately 11:17 p.m. Eastern Time, the spacecraft will execute a deorbit burn lasting around a minute, setting it on a course for re-entry. The spacecraft is expected to touch down at White Sands landing site at 12:04 a.m. Eastern Time, Saturday, September 7th, roughly 6 hours after undocking. While this return mission will be uncrewed, NASA says it will still gather critical data simulating a crewed flight. The spacecraft is outfitted with accelerometers and sensors in the seats that will measure forces akin to those experienced by astronauts during re-entry and landing. Additionally, the interior of Starliner will record environmental data such as pressure and temperature fluctuations, which will be vital for evaluating the vehicle's performance and safety. NASA has scheduled a post-landing press conference to take place at approximately 1:30 Eastern Time, offering a chance to assess the spacecraft's return and discuss any pertinent findings from the mission. Due to the unpredictable New Mexican weather, NASA's prepared backup delays in case of bad weather, such as strong winds or rain, affects the landing plan. These backup opportunities are spaced 4 days apart, providing flexibility to ensure safe landing conditions. It's impossible not to mention the challenges faced by the Starliner crew. The Starliner story reveals different spacesuits designed for astronauts on various spacecraft. The Boeing suits that NASA astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams wore on their journey to the ISS will return to Earth with the uncrewed Starliner. However, Boeing's spacesuits are not compatible with SpaceX's spacecraft. To address this, NASA provided Wilmore and Williams with SpaceX suits for their planned return to Earth on Crew 9, scheduled for late February or early March next year. Williams has tested one of the SpaceX suits currently on the ISS and confirmed it fits well. Meanwhile, a second suit will be sent to the ISS on the future Crew 9 resupply mission for Wilmore. NASA has confirmed that in an emergency, Wilmore and Williams could be evacuated on Crew 8 in the cargo pallet area. However, they would not have access to spacesuits in this situation, raising further safety concerns. Another potential concern relates to the Starliner's thrusters, which NASA suspects may not be fully operational. Fortunately, the spacecraft's equipped with 21 other functioning thrusters, providing redundancy and ensuring Starliner can complete its mission safely. NASA also discussed future certification plans for Starliner. Boeing had initially planned another Starliner mission for February 2025. However, due to technical issues and delays, that mission's now been postponed to August next year. This additional time will allow NASA and Boeing to address any remaining concerns, ensuring Starliner meets all necessary safety requirements and improves its performance for future crewed missions. So, what does the future hold for NASA and Boeing? As Boeing and NASA continue to collaborate to improve Starliner's program, the upcoming uncrewed return will serve as a critical milestone. Although the spacecraft will return to Earth without astronauts on board, this is an important test of Starliner's systems, readiness, and overall capability. The data collected from this mission will inform future crewed flights, solidifying Starliner's role as a key player in NASA's commercial spaceflight program. Looking ahead to 2025 and beyond, Boeing and NASA are working hard to ensure that Starliner can ultimately function as a reliable transportation system for astronauts. Despite delays and challenges, the program remains an integral part of NASA's broader vision for commercial partnerships and the future of human space exploration. Since their arrival aboard the ISS, astronauts Wilmore and Williams have conducted at least 42 experiments, dedicating over 100 hours to research. Their work spans a wide range of disciplines, helping to advance knowledge in areas like biology, physics, and space technologies. Additionally, they've maintained a rigorous schedule of physical fitness, incorporating resistance training and cardio exercises to counteract the physical toll of extended periods in microgravity. Both astronauts are reported to be in excellent health and spirits, frequently staying in touch with their families through NASA's communication network. Their stay aboard the ISS will continue until their return with Crew 9 next year. In the field of aerospace, especially in rocket technology, inheriting proven achievements from the past is not only natural but also encouraged. This inheritance can drive the development of the entire space industry. However, to achieve perfect results, we need to combine learning with creativity. Most engineering projects, be they old or new, inevitably have some weaknesses. If we don't thoroughly study all the key factors, learning can just become copying, a form often referred to as rote learning. So, what are the consequences of blind copying? First, we'll fail to grasp the essence of the issue. In milder cases, this can lead to heading in the wrong direction in a project. More seriously, it can result in unforeseen disasters. And the recent rocket explosion in Europe seems to be one of those cases. As we know, SpaceX, the most successful private company in the past 2 centuries, has consistently been a bright spot that captures the world's attention. Its products like rockets and spacecrafts have broken many records, exactly what other companies envy. This isn't just within the US, but also among competing agencies and organizations across the world. Europe, a region currently lagging in space, is making great efforts to freely launch satellites and humans into space without depending on SpaceX by learning from the successful projects in their company. The newly exploded European rocket named RFA-1 was developed by Rocket Factory Augsburg, a German rocket startup that's leading many competitors in the European commercial launch market. RFA-1 is said to be quite similar to SpaceX's Falcon 9, utilizing some advantageous elements from Starship. The rockets are made of a stainless steel structure with 9 helix engines using kerosene and liquid oxygen on the first stage. All 9 engines generate a thrust of over 200,000 pounds, or about 900 kilonewtons at maximum power, which is only slightly less than Falcon 9's thrust. One Helix engine will power the second stage of the RFA-1 rocket, and the third stage, or orbital transfer vehicle, will complete the mission of placing the payload into orbit. When fully stacked, the rocket stands 30 meters tall compared to Falcon 9's 70 meters, and has the capability to launch 1.3 tons into polar orbit. RFA is one of several European startups developing small commercial satellite launchers. Although the RFA-1 rocket has similarities to Falcon 9, it is the strongest small launch vehicle in the group, and the RFA is the first company to bring flight hardware to the launch site. However, the story's far from easy. During the first static fire test, the rocket exploded. On the evening of August 19th, RFA reported an anomaly leading to the loss of the stage. The company stated that no one was injured and reported that the launch pad had been saved and protected. This is the same rocket RFA planned to launch on its first test flight. The hot fire test was the one with all 9 engines on the first stage of RFA-1. A video of the test showed a fireball flaring up around the base of the rocket as the engines ignited. It's unclear whether all 9 engines exploded. A few minutes later, the engines appeared to shut down as the fire grew larger, with a jet of flames spewing out of the side of the rocket. Eventually, the booster fell off the stand and exploded when hitting the ground. We are now working closely with Saxavord Spaceport and the authorities to gather data and info to essentially resolve what happened, RFA said. We'll take our time to analyze and assess this situation. Earlier this month, the CEO of German aerospace company OHB, which owns nearly 65% of Rocket Factory Augsburg, stated that the full integration of RFA-1 is imminent, followed by a launch attempt in a few weeks. The destruction of the first stage could eliminate any chance of launching the RFA-1 rocket before the end of the year, and depending on the cause of the test failure, it could lead to even longer delays. We develop iteratively with an emphasis on real testing, RFA said. This is part of our philosophy, and we were aware of the higher risks attached to this approach. Our goal is to return to regular operations as soon as possible. These tests are designed to identify faults and issues prior to a full test flight campaign and are all carried out in a highly controlled and regulated environment, said Frank Strang, CEO of Saxavord Spaceport, the first fully licensed vertical launch spaceport in West Europe. It's far too early to know what caused the anomaly, but I'm confident that once RFA gets to the bottom of it, they'll rectify the situation and carry on with their program. Learning from SpaceX is not a bad idea, but hopefully in the end, this learning will result in original projects from European startups, helping them achieve great success rather than harming them. On the other hand, it should also be noted that learning rocket techniques safely, both for people and the surrounding areas, is not easy, and not everyone can do it. Perfect example of this is China. Although the Chinese government always promotes and encourages rocket startups, they seem to disregard the feelings of the public, who are constantly living in a state of fear. This is all due to the recklessness in imitating SpaceX's technology, or more precisely, copying it. Some rockets in China have blown up during launch and even in early-stage tests right there on the launch pad. On August 6th, with the aim of building a mega constellation similar to SpaceX's Starlink, China launched its first batch of broadband satellites. The rocket deployed the satellites in a polar orbit at an altitude of around 500 miles above Earth's surface. However, after deploying the satellites, the rocket's upper stage appears to have broken apart. Space tracking firm Slingshot Aerospace recorded more than 50 fragments of debris within the vicinity of the satellites following their deployment, forming a trail of space junk that poses a major hazard to satellite constellations of the same altitude, the firm wrote. The satellites are the first group in China's planned 14,000 satellite mega constellation, aimed at improving broadband services across the country. This is obviously an ominous start and a potentially bad sign of things to come. If even a fraction of the launches needed to field this Chinese mega constellation generate as much debris as the first launch, the result would be a notable addition to the space debris population in low Earth orbit, Audrey Schaefer, VP of Strategy and Policy at Slingshot Aerospace, said. This is not the first time China's Long March 6A rocket has caused trouble in Earth orbit. In 2022, the rocket's upper stage broke apart 50 pieces of space debris, which later expanded into a massive cloud of 350 pieces. The space junk came eerily close to SpaceX's Starlink satellites, but no damage was reported. The rocket's upper stage is supposed to re-enter Earth's atmosphere in one piece and burn up upon re-entry. It's unclear what caused the rocket to break apart in space, but this incident contributes to the growing problem of orbital debris. Not to mention, another Chinese rocket also exploded, but it happened during testing. The first stage of the Tianlong 3 rocket left its launch pad due to a structural failure at the connection between the rocket and the test stand, said the company Beijing Tianbing, also known as Space Pioneer. The rocket landed in a hilly area at the Ganji of central China, it said. Video footage from the incident showed the rocket soaring straight in the air before losing power and turning horizontally, falling back down to Earth, then blowing up into flames on nearby hills. An investigation of the unplanned flight found there were no reports of casualties, thankfully, it said. Parts of the rocket stage were scattered within a safe area, but caused a local fire, according to a separate statement from the Ganji Emergency Management Bureau. The fire has since been extinguished and no one was hurt, the Bureau said. The two-stage Tianlong 3 Skydragon 3 is a partly reusable rocket under development by Space Pioneer, one of a small group of private sector rocket makers that have grown rapidly over the last 5 years. Falling rocket debris in China after launches is not unheard of, but it's very rare for part of a rocket under development to make an unplanned flight out of its test site and then crash. According to Space Pioneer, the first stage of the Tianlong 3 ignited normally during a hot test, but later detached from the test bench due to structural failure. A rocket can consist of several stages, with the first or lowest stage igniting and propelling the rocket upwards upon its launch. When the fuel's exhausted, the first stage falls off and the second stage ignites, keeping the rocket in propulsion. Space Pioneer says the performance of the Tianlong 3 is comparable to SpaceX's Falcon 9, which is also a two-stage rocket. In 2023, Space Pioneer launched a kerosene-oxygen rocket, the Tianlong 3, becoming the first private Chinese firm to send liquid propellant rocket into space. While many companies are focusing on satellite production, pioneering businesses like Space Pioneer are turning their attention to developing reusable liquid fuel rockets, a breakthrough that promises to reduce costs for space missions. There's no denying that SpaceX, a giant in the rapidly evolving space sector, has had a tremendous impact on this. Their vision and success have inspired the entire industry, driving a global space technology race. However, in this context, Chinese rocket companies are at a crossroads. If they continue down the path of imitation without investing in independent research and development, they risk not only falling behind, but also potentially causing severe consequences. Innovation and creativity, rather than mere imitation, are the keys to achieving safe and sustainable progress in this challenging field of space technology. After nearly a decade of research and development, we can finally see Blue Origin starting to get serious about the development of their first orbital rocket, New Glenn. And with the recent appearance of the rocket's first and second stage, Blue Origin and NASA have successfully set a new launch date for New Glenn, positioning it precisely as a Starship killer. So, what is Blue Origin prepared for the New Glenn rocket launch to outshine SpaceX? Can they really catch up with SpaceX? Does NASA feel threatened about its Mars payload after choosing New Glenn? On the 26th of last month, NASA announced that the mission involving New Glenn is scheduled for launch October 13th with the Escapade mission. This is the right time for a journey to Mars, which happens every 26 months when Earth's in perfect position relative to Mars for efficient travel. Blue Origin's first New Glenn rocket is going to take off from Launch Complex 36 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, officially making its debut after years of delays in development. On September 4th, the company confidently posted some exciting images of New Glenn's second stage, which is said to be the actual flight hardware. The launch company is targeting a hot fire test of the upper stage, powered by two BE-3U engines within about a week. We're looking forward to firing up those two BE-3Us on New Glenn's second stage in a few days, they said. Moreover, the arrival of an unmanned ship named Jacqueline at Port Canaveral, painted blue and bearing Blue Origin's distinctive feather logo on September 4th, further signals that the first launch of New Glenn is finally approaching, with bold efforts to land the rocket's first stage. Welcome home, Jacqueline. This sea-based landing platform is where New Glenn's reusable booster will return home again and again after each mission to be quickly refurbished for its next flight, Blue Origin said in a post. According to Space Offshore, Jacqueline's 380 feet long and 150 feet wide, equivalent to 116 by 46 meters, making it smaller than SpaceX's drone ships, which are about 170 meters, 560 feet long, and 50 meters, 160 feet wide. The new unmanned ship, named after Bezos' mom, with a billionaire founder of Blue Origin, is nicknamed Jacqueline. However, the ship's legal name is Landing Platform Vessel Number 1. Jacqueline's a new ship specifically designed to serve as a landing platform for New Glenn. The ship's construction started in Romania last year and was completed in Brest, France around last month. Jacqueline departed from Brest to Florida August 8th. The early arrival of Blue Origin's drone ship clearly demonstrates their goal of completing a booster landing on New Glenn's very first launch. However, we must remember that success isn't guaranteed, as SpaceX was unable to land its first Falcon 9 on the ocean until the rocket's 23rd launch. But Bezos and Blue Origin are determined to collect as much data as possible from New Glenn's maiden flight to achieve larger booster reusability ASAP. Whether they succeed or not, this effort's going to be exciting for sure, as New Glenn will become a formidable competitor for SpaceX. New Glenn joins SpaceX's Falcon Heavy and Starship as privately developed heavy-lift rockets. Its launch will solidify the trend in U.S. spaceflight towards large, reusable, commercially developed rockets. Both Bezos and SpaceX founder Elon Musk have identified lower-cost, rapidly reusable rockets as the key to expanding human activity in space. Most notably, with a scheduled launch in early next month, New Glenn's launch will coincide with the fifth flight of the world's largest rocket, Starship. We don't know if there's any favoritism here, like with the Starliner launch ahead of Starship Flight 4, where the government agency prioritized Boeing over SpaceX, but in this case, it's going to be Blue Origin's New Glenn, and if that happens, we might have to wait quite a while for the launch, but hopefully that's not going to happen again. We do need some fairness among licensing agencies. But Blue Origin still has a lot of work to do in the upcoming months if New Glenn was supposed to be ready to launch with the Escapade mission to Mars during this year's launch window. Blue Origin's not yet completed a New Glenn rocket during a countdown rehearsal, and hasn't fully loaded cryogenic fuel into the launch vehicle, and has not fully tested the first or second stage engines. These activities typically occur months before the first launch of a new orbital rocket. For comparison, SpaceX tested its first fully assembled Falcon 9 rocket on the launch pad about 3 months before its first flight in 2010. ULA completed a hot fire test of its Vulcan rocket on the launch pad last year, about 7 months prior to its first flight. However, Blue Origin is making clear progress towards New Glenn's first flight after years of speculation and few signs of external progress. Earlier this year, the company rolled a fully assembled 320-foot New Glenn rocket to the launch pad at Cape Canaveral Space Station and loaded liquid nitrogen into it, a cryogenic substitute for the liquid methane and liquid hydrogen it's going to burn during flight. More recently, Blue Origin lifted a full-scale test booster with a crane at Port Canaveral, a few miles south of the launch pad, to demonstrate how the company will recover New Glenn's reusable booster from its landing barge. When it reaches Mars, the twin Escapade spacecraft will measure plasma and magnetic fields around the red planet. With simultaneous observations from 2 locations around Mars, scientists hope to learn more about the processes stripping atoms from the magnetosphere and upper atmosphere, driving climate change on Mars. Rocket Lab designed, built, and tested the 2 Escapade spacecraft in just over 3 years, a relatively fast pace for an interplanetary science mission. NASA selected the Escapade mission for development in 2019 as part of a new class of small planetary science missions, where scientists could propose concepts for modest probes to explore the solar system. Escapade was initially set to launch as a piggyback payload with NASA's Psyche asteroid mission in 2022, but the agency decided to move the Psyche launch from a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket to the bigger Falcon Heavy. So they changed their launch targets, and in doing so, it kind of broke our mission design, or at least very nearly broke it, Rob Lillis, the mission's lead scientist from Berkeley Space Science Laboratory, said. We had to do a rapid redesign of the spacecraft and the mission with only about 2 months prior to our preliminary design review back in 2020, and it was a disaster, he said. We failed our PDR, but it really wasn't our fault, so NASA gave us another couple $1 million, and it was 10 more months to come up with a mission design that was resilient and flexible and could work with a range of different launch options. The redesign resulted in size growth for the Escapade probes and a change in spacecraft builders from TVAC to Rocket Lab. So that was the first thing, and then there were certainly challenges on the Rocket Lab side, Lillis said. The thruster changed. There were also significant problems getting tanks delivered, so they really went into hero mode. They went and actually spun up an entire internal 3D tank printing capability from nothing. Once things started looking shaky with this tank supplier, they came through. The Escapade spacecraft is based on Rocket Lab's Explorer class design, a new version of the Photon spacecraft platform itself derived from the kick stage of the company's Electron rocket. We've already been to the moon for NASA, so we're excited to build on that and send Rocket Lab technology deeper into the solar system, this time to the red planet. Rocket Lab founder and CEO Sir Peter Beck said in a statement, "Our space systems team has a beautiful and highly capable pair of spacecraft to help NASA and the University of California, Berkeley further humanity's understanding of Mars." The time pressure on Blue Origin is growing as New Glenn races to be ready for the narrow launch window of the Escapade mission to Mars. A large rocket like New Glenn still faces limitations, including the inability to send Escapade directly to Mars after the end of October. Given these constraints, it wouldn't be surprising if New Glenn isn't ready to fully launch Escapade within this narrow time frame. However, there are important factors at play that make NASA more willing to accept certain risks with this mission. Escapade, being a relatively low-cost mission, allows NASA some flexibility. In contrast with higher stakes missions worth billions of dollars, NASA can afford to take a bit more risk with Escapade. This isn't a mission like the $5 billion Europa Clipper, where a proven rocket would be mandatory. Instead, Escapade is part of NASA's venture class acquisition of dedicated and rideshare program, which is designed to launch lower-cost missions with reduced oversight. It's worth noting that these contracts come with fewer stringent requirements than the more traditional launch contracts used for expensive flagship missions. VADR essentially serves as a testing ground for emergency launch providers to demonstrate their capabilities without the same level of scrutiny. This means NASA is more willing to give companies like BO a shot, even if the rocket hasn't yet fully proven itself in flight. This lower-risk, low-cost approach aligns with NASA's goal of fostering innovation in the commercial spaceflight industry, allowing companies like Blue Origin to get experience with actual payloads. Assuming Escapade does launch this year, the twin spacecraft would arrive in orbit around Mars on September 1st and 3rd in 2025. Once there, they'll begin their scientific investigations, studying plasma and magnetic fields around Mars, which could provide insights into how Mars's atmosphere has been stripped away over time. This data is key for understanding the climate history and whether or not we could potentially live there. However, if Escapade misses the 2024 launch window, the consequences could be pretty big. The next opportunity to launch towards Mars won't happen until late 2026 due to the alignment of Earth and Mars, which occurs only every 26 months. This means a delay would set the mission by over 2 years, which would not only impact scientific objectives, but also increase costs for mission operations and storage. After a period of time, SpaceX has finally broken the quiet regarding the launch date for its 5th Starship test flight. Unfortunately, it's not good news for us space enthusiasts, as the Starship flight's been delayed even further, now pushed to the end of November, and this is all due to the FAA getting in the way. So what's the reason, and how angry was Elon? In recent weeks, engineers at the Starship launch facility in South Texas have upgraded the launch pad to carry out an ambitious plan to catch Super Heavy when it returns to Earth. The booster, bigger than a Boeing 747, will land vertically using Raptor engines, slowing down to almost a hover before getting caught by 2 mechanical arms on the launch pad. This is going to be the first time SpaceX tests the technique of catching a rocket mid-air. Although Super Heavy is designed for reuse, like the first stage of the Falcon 9, the recovery method is a little bit different. Instead of landing on an offshore platform hundreds of miles out, SpaceX aims to bring back the booster directly to the launch pad. If that's successful, this technique will simplify the process and cut operational costs. Everything would be fine if SpaceX were granted permission by the FAA to launch on the scheduled date. But the FAA not only dismissed launch dates in late September or early next month, but delayed the flight even further, not now until at least November. It's understandable that such a unique operation would require additional time to analyze from a licensing perspective, SpaceX said. Unfortunately, instead of focusing resources on critical safety analysis and collaborating on rational safeguards to protect both the public and the environment, the licensing process has been repeatedly derailed by issues ranging from the frivolous to the patently absurd. Elon Musk, who has repeatedly placed his trust in earlier launch schedules, has grown very impatient with the latest news from the FAA. He shared related tweets, particularly a SpaceX tweet emphasizing the importance of Starship for future missions. Starship's fully and rapidly reusable design will exponentially increase humanity's ability to access and utilize outer space. To unlock its full potential and do it rapidly enough to meet commitments to national priorities like NASA's Artemis program, Starships need to fly. Indeed, it is crucial for Starship to conduct timely test flights as it undergoes development. SpaceX needs Starship to demo new tech in order to quickly create the most perfect version of the biggest and most powerful spacecraft in the world. The more we fly safely, the faster we learn. The faster we learn, the sooner we realize full and rapid rocket reuse, according to SpaceX. Additionally, in a podcast interview, Elon outlined that
the next flight of Starship is ready to fly. We are waiting for regulatory approval.
Quipping at the slow regulatory process for Starship Flight 5, he added,
"It really should not be possible to build a giant rocket faster than the paper can move from one desk to another."
This confirms that the only barrier for Starship's Flight 5 now is the launch permit from the FAA. Even more importantly is the ambition of getting to Mars, the only way to save humanity from Earth's doomsday. Elon also tweeted, "We will never get humanity to Mars if this continues." So, why does the FAA need to downplay the urgency of such missions, critical to both national and human interests, just because of false and misleading reports built on bad faith hysterics from online detractors or special interest groups who presented poorly constructed science as fact? SpaceX also asserts that the delays from the FAA aren't based on new safety concerns, but rather unnecessary environmental analysis. The initial reason cited for further FAA investigation was Starship's water-cooled steel flame deflector. This component's become the target of false reports, wrongly accusing it of polluting the environment or operating entirely outside regulations. These stories overlook basic facts, which have either been ignored or deliberately misunderstood. In reality, SpaceX has never operated the deflector without a permit. The company's acted in good faith under a general multi-sector permit, including flood discharge activities under the supervision of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. SpaceX worked closely with TCEQ to implement multiple mitigation measures before use, including the installation of containment tanks, the construction of protective barriers, sealing discharge points during operations, and using only portable water, which never comes into contact with any industrial processes. Several permits were granted and came into effect in July of last year. TCEQ officials were present and in person during the first test of the water spray system and were given the opportunity to watch activities around the launch time. The water-cooled steel deflector does not release pollutants into the surrounding environment. Once again, it literally uses potable water. Water discharge from the system has been sampled after each use, consistently showing negligible traces of any pollutants, with all levels below the thresholds permitted by state discharge permits. TCEQ, the FAA, Fish and Wildlife, they've all reviewed the system's uses before its initial deployment and during tests and launches, determining that no, it's not going to harm the environment. Of course, there have been questions about claims that SpaceX had to pay fines to CEQ and the EPA. SpaceX clarified that the fines were entirely related to paperwork discrepancies. And the rumors that SpaceX's water is hurting the environment, that's just false. The next two reasons that prompted further scrutiny by the FAA are changes to Starship that have been in place for some time, leaving one to wonder what the FAA has been doing these last 3 months, only for these changes to now become reasons. According to the company, the two main reasons for the delay are the hot staging interstage and the landing profile for catching Super Heavy Starship with a launch tower. These issues led the FAA to ask for an additional 60-day consultation with the National Marine Fisheries Service regarding the hot staging interstage with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services regarding the landing profile. For the ring, SpaceX shared that the only proposed modification for Starship's fifth flight is a marginal change in the splashdown location of the hot stage, which produces no increase in likelihood for impacting marine life. This single issue, which was already exhaustively analyzed, could indefinitely delay launch without addressing any plausible impact to the environment, SpaceX said. Since Starship Super Heavy will return to the launch tower, it'll inevitably create sonic booms, and as a slightly larger area could experience a sonic boom, the FAA has now requested additional consultations. SpaceX previously released an assessment back in July explaining that Starship's sonic booms would not pose a danger when the FAA publicly reviewed the company's plan to accelerate the frequency of Starship launches in Texas. In its release, SpaceX notes that sonic booms were present during NASA's space shuttle return and were also a regular part of the Falcon 9 booster landings. It adds that the booms created by a Super Heavy booster will be more powerful than those generated by Falcon landings. However, SpaceX believes it will not pose any risk of injury to those in the surrounding areas, since the strongest effects will be localized to the areas immediately around the Starbase launch pad. All this stems from the FAA's delays in processing permits. Last year, company officials urged the FAA to double its licensing staff to handle apps for commercial launches and reentry. Congress approved a funding increase for the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation of $42 million for FY24. Over the past year, FAA's Space Office added 35 workers, bringing the total staff to 158. But this still seems insufficient given the slow pace in processing launch permits and the lack of resources to oversee space activities. SpaceX argues that the delay in launching the next Starship test flight isn't due to technical readiness, but rather that the FAA is just overwhelmed by the rapid growth of the commercial launch industry. With SpaceX launching rockets quickly and other companies conducting human suborbital spaceflights, the FAA has had to significantly expand its operations. However, there's a stark reality that not all companies are scrutinized by the FAA as closely as SpaceX. For example, Boeing. The Starliner has not been subject to nearly as many investigations, even though it failed to return astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams to Earth. Starliner still receives certification without much difficulty. This is due to the company's business structure, which mirrors the bureaucratic nature of the government, as Boeing generates significant revenue from government contracts. Elon commented.
Well, I mean, I think Boeing is a company that is, They actually do so much business with the government. They have sort of impedance match to the government. So they're like basically one notch away from the government, maybe two. They're not far from the government from an efficiency standpoint because they derive so much of their revenue from the government.
Commenting on Boeing's recent leadership changes that has seen a new CEO take charge, Musk stated, "I think at least up until perhaps recently, because they have a new CEO who actually shows up in the factory, and the CEO before that, I think, had a degree in accounting and never went to the factory and didn't know how airplanes flew. I think if you're in charge of a company that makes airplanes fly and spacecraft go to orbit, then it can't be a total mystery as to how they work. Marketing knowledge for CEOs of consumer products like carbonated beverages is fine, believes Musk, but a CEO of an aircraft and spacecraft company needs to understand how these vehicles work." As for Starship, Musk shared that
Starship is the first rocket design where success is one of the possible outcomes with full reusability. So for any given project, you have to say, this is the circle, so we've got Venn diagrams. Here's a circle, and it is success, the success dot in the circle, is success in the set of possible outcomes.
there are projects where success is not in the possible outcome, but with Starship, not only is success one outcome, but it's already being proven with each launch, believes the executive. SpaceX once amazed the world by successfully landing a rocket booster, but now they're facing even a bolder challenge: catching a giant rocket falling out of the sky. In Starship Flight 5 to catch the Super Heavy, the key factor is not just how the rocket lands, but also the synchronized movement of the giant catching arms that are part of the Mechazilla. So, as a new milestone's approaching, SpaceX is speeding up upgrades to these arms. What have they done so far? Are there any challenges waiting for SpaceX in Flight 5? With what's been revealed over time, we all know that SpaceX is determined to catch the Starship booster Super Heavy during the upcoming launch, even though some skeptics are doubting this, knowing that it carries certain risks. However, to pioneer or break older conventions, one must not be afraid. SpaceX is remarkable in its belief in the long-term and vast potential that catching the rocket is going to bring. The process of catching the rocket is entirely handled by a tower that CEO Elon calls Mechazilla. This tower is equipped with various functions to support the whole operation. Mechazilla's simplest part is a third arm that's vertically fixed in place but can swing left and right. This swing arm contains plumbing and an umbilical device that connects to Starship's upper stage, supplying propellant, gas, power, and connectivity. But more importantly, there's an essential component: a pair of giant, far more complex arms known as chopsticks. Giant hinges connect the pair of arms to a carriage that grabs onto 3 of the tower's 4 legs with a dozen skate-like appendages. These skates are outfitted with wheels, allowing the carriage to roll up and down tracks built into the tower's legs. The carriage, which also carries complex hydraulic systems enabling the bus-sized arms to move, is connected by steel cables to a heavy-duty tractor capable of lifting the hundreds of tons assembly up and down the tower. The tower's arms will be able to lift, maneuver, stack, and unstack Starship and Super Heavy with precision, even when it gets windy. And now, these arms are also key to safely catching Super Heavy. With just a short amount of time left until the next Starship launch, it's clear that SpaceX must take full advantage of this time to test and fine-tune the crucial chopstick components, increasing their chances of success in the mission ahead. The quick disconnect, or QD area, has become the focal point of significant work on the chopsticks. Last week, we observed the installation of several new parts, and it seems that this work is ongoing, with workers currently using scaffolding right next to the QD system, indicating the modification improvements are still in progress. At the top of the booster's QD section, we noticed additional welding, likely to reinforce the hood. This is a sensible precaution, as this area is particularly vulnerable to damage if the booster fails to land accurately on the chopsticks and instead falls onto the launch pad. Moreover, this is also the area where the booster's exhaust will be directed during the catch process, making it crucial to protect this section to minimize the need for refurbishments between flights. As is customary at Starbase, a quick test will be conducted once the work is completed. In this case, you might see the BQD section moving again after the reinforcement work's finished, marking an important step in the system's testing process. A significant effort to improve the system's durability has also been completed with the installation of protective pads and shields on the chopsticks. These bumper pads are designed to absorb impact forces and prevent damage to both the booster and the chopsticks during the catch. The installation process was methodical, with workers carefully attaching the pads to the steel framework. These pads, being softer than the steel structure, are essential for cushioning the booster upon contact. In recent days, crews have fully installed the impact pads on the right boom. Pads numbered 1 through 8 were installed first, followed by pad 9, which was lifted, lowered, and finally secured into place. This was followed by the installation of pads 10 and 11. Then, pad 6 was removed and reinstalled along with pad 12. Finally, pads 13 through 17 were added, completing the padding on this boom. SpaceX has been testing the deployment of the landing rail, a crucial component that will guide the booster's landing onto the chopsticks. The landing rail extends vertically and serves as the primary contact point for the booster's landing pins. Recent tests have involved raising and lowering the rail to ensure smooth operation and precise alignment with the booster. These tests, conducted even during the night, are critical to ensuring that the system functions flawlessly during an actual catch. Currently, work on this section is still ongoing, and eventually SpaceX will have to conduct a test with the B-14.1 test tank to fully assess the performance of the new upgrades before moving on to the 5th Starship flight. It's sure to be exciting, and stay tuned for that. Don't forget that the potential launch date for Flight 5 is at the end of September, and if you're curious, you can check out our previous video. Another question many rocket enthusiasts are asking about is the potential risks of catching Super Heavy and even Starship itself. Why is it that SpaceX and Elon are still determined to accomplish what many consider impossible? Since at least late 2020, SpaceX CEO Elon's been floating the idea of catching Starships and Super Heavy boosters out of the sky as an alternative to having the several dozen-ton steel rockets use basic legs to land on the ground. This would be a major departure from SpaceX's highly successful Falcon family, which lands on a relatively complex set of deployable legs that can be retracted after most landings. The flexible, lightweight structures have mostly been reliable and easily reusable, but Falcon boosters occasionally have rough landings, which can use up disposable shock absorbers or even damage the legs and make boosters hard to safely recover and slower to reuse. As a smaller rocket, Falcon boosters have to be extremely lightweight to ensure the healthy payload margins and likely weigh about 25 to 30 tons empty and 450 tons fully fueled, an excellent mass ratio for a reusable rocket. While it's still good to continue that practice of rigorous mass optimization with Starship, the vehicle is an entirely different story. After dozens of upgrade campaigns, Starship will be capable of launching over 200 tons of payload into low Earth orbit with the ability to recover the booster and spacecraft. For a booster or Starship catch, the rocket will approach the tower, enter the gap between the splayed arms, hover in place while the arms close around it, then eventually come to rest on hard points that appear to offer about as much surface area as a coffee table. This means that the Super Heavy's landing process will be gentler compared to the suicide burn SpaceX typically uses for Falcon 9. We're used to seeing Falcon 9 come down quite hard with landing because if it's cut too short, the rocket's going to crash and blow up. But if it's too long, the rocket bounces off the ground, then flies back up, then flips over, and then explodes. We've seen both cases happen with Falcons in the past. The reason for this is twofold. First, to use as little fuel as possible, hovering even for a few seconds requires reserving a lot of fuel. Second, an empty Falcon 9 is very light compared to the very powerful Merlin engines, so it can't really decelerate enough to keep the booster hovering. And this raises an interesting question to ponder. Can Super Heavy successfully land within such a narrow landing target? Well, there's really no issue. Once again, we can compare it to Falcon 9. That booster can land in a fairly small circle, even on a drone ship floating in the ocean. When Falcon 9 boosters land on the ground, they almost always touch down in the center of the pad. And Falcon can only steer using grid fins. It does not have a gimbaled engine, and it does not have hovering capability. If we look at Blue Origin's new Shepard booster, it can perform some extremely slow and controlled landings on the ground with fins and hovering capability, but still lacks control from a gimbaled engine. So, with all the advanced technology in Super Heavy, the combination of grid fins, gimbaled engines, and the hovering capability we saw for a few seconds in the fourth launch, I don't see any reason why it couldn't land literally immediately if it had to. The chopsticks are a component that supports the rocket catching process, potentially saving a small amount of turnaround time after recovery by eliminating the need for cranes or the same arms to attach to a landed booster or spacecraft. They can also save dry mass needed for landing legs, although all interplanetary ships still need legs. However, they also turn proving their own effectiveness into a nightmare. By all appearances, the current recovery mechanisms on the arms and the hard landing points on the spacecraft and booster mean that a catch could fail if either stage is off the center by more than a foot or two or rotates a few degrees in the wrong direction. With the method SpaceX has devised, even the smallest mistake could easily end with a massive rocket, compressed and partially loaded with fuel, destroying the chopsticks and crashing to the ground from a few hundred feet up, ensuring an explosion that could damage surrounding infrastructure or start a fire. In case of more significant anomalies during landing, Starship or Super Heavy could accidentally collide with a launch tower, damaging or even completely destroying the skyscraper-sized structure. At least to some extent, SpaceX may be aware of this, and in some updates from Elon after the 4 Starship launch, he mentioned a software program that allowed the Super Heavy rocket to assess the danger during landing and then decide whether or not to crash on land or at sea. Besides, the decision to catch Super Heavy on SpaceX's 5th launch is a wise choice. Although catching is still risky, it's at least better than SpaceX catching Starship too soon. After developing the most powerful rocket ever built, SpaceX will prioritize simplifying and increasing the reliability of the rocket. This may involve sacrificing some payload capacity in favor of adding heavier but simpler and more robust systems. A prime example is the hot staging section added after the first Starship launch. Then, after Starship completes a few orbital flights and accumulates extensive experience and data, SpaceX could fine-tune the rocket, gradually reducing its mass and increasing payload capacity by optimizing or replacing less efficient systems and designs. From this, we can also see that the current version of Starship or the engineering methods they are using are not final. As the world develops and technology advances, SpaceX certainly won't stand still. The image of a very large spacecraft landing by gliding down a runway more than a decade ago is likely still an unforgettable memory for all us space enthusiasts. But that doesn't mean we can no longer have a chance to witness such an awesome spectacle. The technology of the space shuttle has been reinvented for the modern era under the name Dream Chaser. NASA's Space Shuttle program was a cornerstone of the Space Transportation System (STS) initiative proposed in 1969 to create a reusable spacecraft to make space travel more cost-effective and accessible. Unlike previous single-use capsules, Space Shuttle was designed with a versatile space plane in mind that could launch like a rocket, operate in orbit as a spacecraft, then come back down to Earth as a glider landing on a runway. Space Shuttle consisted of 3 main components: the orbiter vehicle, where the crew and payload were housed, the external fuel tank, which provided fuel to the orbiter's main engines during launch, and then the solid rocket boosters, which provided the additional thrust needed to escape Earth's gravity. The shuttle's design included ceramic tiles for thermal protection during re-entry, allowing the spacecraft to get reused for multiple missions. Over its 30-year operational period, the Space Shuttle program achieved many milestones, including the launch and repair of numerous satellites, the deployment of the Hubble Space Telescope, and the construction and servicing of the ISS. However, the program also faced some challenges, notably the tragic losses of the Challenger in 1986 and then Columbia in 2003. These accidents, which resulted in the very unfortunate death of 14 astronauts, highlighted critical design flaws and underscored the risks inherent in human spaceflight. The investigation into the Columbia disaster revealed serious issues with the shuttle's thermal protection system and NASA's management processes. As a result, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board recommended the retirement of the shuttle fleet. Coupled with the high costs of maintaining and operating an aging spacecraft, the decision was made to retire the Space Shuttle in 2011. Following the shuttle's retirement, NASA relied on Russia's Soyuz spacecraft to transport astronauts to and from the ISS until the advent of SpaceX's Crew Dragon in 2020. Since then, Dragon and Soyuz have taken turns transporting astronauts to the ISS. But this past year, Dragon's primarily taken on the role. Starliner was also intended by NASA to share these missions with Dragon, but that key seems to be rusted and no longer viable for future use. Regardless, a spaceplane remains an idea that NASA is still intrigued by. Since the retirement of NASA's Space Shuttle, there have been significant advancements in space technology that have reignited interest in spaceplanes as a viable means of space travel. Innovations in materials science, propulsion systems, and aerodynamics have led to the development of spacecraft that are not only safer, but also more efficient and cost-effective. Traditional space capsules, like those used in the Apollo and Soyuz programs, are typically single-use vehicles that require extensive resources to retrieve and replace after each mission. In contrast, reusable spaceplanes can get flown multiple times, and that cuts the overall cost of getting up to space. This reusability, combined with lower maintenance costs and the ability to land on regular conventional runways, makes spaceplanes an attractive option for both the government agencies and private companies looking to reduce expenses associated with space exploration. Sierra Space's Dream Chaser stands out as a leading example of the modern spaceplane. Building on the lessons learned from the shuttle program, Dream Chaser incorporates the latest advancement in heat-resistant materials, aerodynamics, and propulsion technology. Designed to be a versatile and reliable vehicle, Dream Chaser is capable of both crewed and uncrewed missions, making it a flexible solution for a variety of space ops. Its ability to land on standard runways allows for immediate access to cargo and crew, further enhancing its efficiency and usability. Sierra Space is currently preparing for the first flight of its spacecraft named Tenacity. That's a cargo variant of the DC-100 spaceplane model, aimed at revolutionizing space cargo transport. DC-100 model boasts several innovative design features that enhance both its performance and safety. One advancement is the use of larger heat-resistant tiles, which provides superior protection during re-entry. Despite being only a quarter the size of the shuttle orbiter, Dream Chaser's heat shields are larger, measuring approximately 10 by 10 inches compared to the 6 by 6 inch tiles used by NASA. Similar to the Space Shuttle, each tile on Dream Chaser is uniquely designed, but the vehicle requires just over 2,000 individual tiles. This is a big reduction compared to the approximately 30,000 tiles needed for each Space Shuttle, and that greatly simplifies the replacement process following each flight. Each tile on the spaceplane is made from a more durable material than those used on NASA spacecraft, though they are still primarily consisting of silica. Most of the white materials visible on the Space Shuttle were thermal blankets rather than tiles. As newer orbiters were built, the vehicles tended to use more thermal blankets to reduce their weight. Dream Chaser features both black and white tiles, while Sierra Space, noting that the primary difference between the two tiles lies in the special additives used in the outer glass coating. Unlike the Space Shuttle, which required certain parts of the orbiter to be reinforced to withstand re-entry temps, such as the nose and leading edges of the wings, NASA used specialized tiles made from reinforced carbon-carbon or RCC in those areas to endure those higher temps. In contrast, Dream Chaser does not have RCC tiles. Its standard tiles can withstand temperatures up to 2,600 Fahrenheit for multiple re-entry cycles, while the specialized tiles can endure even higher temperatures for single-use applications. These tiles serve multiple purposes. In addition to protecting the vehicle during re-entry, they help regulate the spacecraft's internal temperature when exposed to direct sunlight. Temperatures can reach up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit in daylight conditions in orbit. The tiles help maintain a stable temperature for experiments and eventually for the humans inside. Complementing the DC-100 is the Shooting Star cargo module, which extends the spaceplane's cargo capacity. It's a 15-foot-long attachment to the back of the Dream Chaser that can carry up to 10,000 pounds of additionalized pressurized and unpressurized cargo, such as scientific equipment and supplies to the ISS during NASA resupply missions. The Shooting Star module is designed not only for cargo transport, but also for waste disposal. During its mission, it can handle critical waste before separating and burning up upon re-entry, thereby maintaining the cleanliness of space operations. The launch and re-entry process for Dream Chaser is meticulously engineered to ensure safety and efficiency. Initially, the spacecraft and its Shooting Star module are encapsulated within a payload fairing on a rocket, protecting them from debris and reducing the ascent load. Once in space, the rocket deploys the Dream Chaser, which then unfolds its wings and solar panels to enter flight configuration. It'll then extend its landing gear and test its systems and performance before docking. These tests include successful communication with the ISS and following its commands, such as holding position and retreating when requested. Just before docking, it will stop 38 feet from the station and wait for the Canadarm2 robotic arm to grab a fixture on the cargo module. Upon completing its mission, the spacecraft comes back to Earth, with the Shooting Star module detaching and burning up in the atmosphere, while the DC-100 lands on the runway. This design allows for a quick recovery of valuable cargo and facilitates efficient turnaround for future missions. Future flights may carry up to 11,500 pounds of cargo, bringing back up to 3,500 pounds of cargo to Earth, and be ready for launch again in just 24 hours. After docking with the station, it stays there for 45 days before being detached. It'll then wait for an opportunity to return home where the weather and landing conditions are favorable. The Shooting Star module detaches and burns up in the atmosphere, while Dream Chaser lands on a runway. The onboard computers will commit to the return flight path, and the spacecraft will glide to the landing point at the Launch and Landing Facility at Kennedy Space Center. Of course, that assumes that all goes according to plan. Now, the spacecraft is in its final testing and launch preparation phase at the KSC in Florida. Inside the Space Systems Processing Facility, where components of the ISS were once housed, the Dream Chaser is undergoing some pretty extensive work. This includes the installation of the thermal protection system to ensure it can withstand that reentry, as well as the propulsion system closeout and leak testing. The launch date for Dream Chaser's first flight was initially scheduled this spring. However, it's been delayed. A new launch date has yet to be determined, but is expected to happen next year. Both Sierra Space Team and NASA are working tirelessly to make this launch happen. Looking forward to the future, Sierra Space is actively shaping the future of space exploration through a range of ambitious projects and collaboration. Building on the success of Dream Chaser's DC-100, the company is now working on the development of the DC-200, a spaceplane designed specifically for crewed missions. This next-gen spacecraft will be capable of safely transporting astronauts to and from LEO, offering a versatile and reliable solution for future human spaceflight. In addition to its spacecraft development, Sierra Space is a key partner in the Orbital Reef Project, an innovative space station initiative led by Blue Origin. A central component of the Orbital Reef Project is the development of the Large Integrated Flexible Environment, or LIFE Habitat, a state-of-the-art expandable space structure designed by Sierra Space. The LIFE Habitat is essentially a 3-story inflatable module that can be compactly stored during launch and then expanded in space to provide a spacious living and working environment for the astronauts. This innovative design maximizes usable space while minimizing launch costs, making it a key element in the future of space living. Beyond these commercial ventures, Sierra Space is also expanding its footprint in the defense sector. The company has secured several significant contracts, including a 10-year agreement with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency to develop lunar infrastructure capabilities. This project focuses on extracting oxygen and storing energy on the moon, which are critical for sustaining future lunar missions. Additionally, Sierra Space just got awarded a $740 million contract by the Space Development Agency to develop 18 missile warning and tracking satellites, further cementing its role in national security and defense. And that concludes today's episode. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.